The Canadian Museum of History's Canada Hall and its $30 million rebranding and renovating project is coming to an end, with its grand opening set for July 1st. Canada Hall has been closed since 2014 for extensive renovations and for what seems to be a different approach to Canada's historical narrative. According to the CBC, in 2013, the museum's Director of Research, Dean Oliver, described the previous Canada Hall as only recounting the arrival of white people in the 11th century to the groovy years of the 1970s. Patricia Lynch is the Director of Corporate Affairs at the Canadian Museum of History. We corresponded via email. She says the newly branded Canadian History Hall will include a more complete picture of Canada's history, beginning with its earliest Indigenous settlers roughly 15,000 years ago. It will certainly be very inclusive of the stories of Indigenous people, and will in fact begin long before the arrival of Europeans, says Lynch. It will begin with Indigenous creation stories. The hall will present the story of Canada through multiple perspectives, including those of Aboriginal peoples. She even offered some insight into what to expect out of the new exhibit. The stories of Indigenous peoples will be woven throughout the entire History Hall, she writes. The museum worked closely with Indigenous collaborators, cultural experts, and stakeholders in developing the storyline. Many of the History Hall's artifacts will illustrate both ancient and modern Indigenous history. Still, many aren't convinced that these symbolic gestures do much good for Canada's highly marginalized Indigenous population. Hayden King is part of the Anishinaabe First Nation, acquired his PhD at McMaster, and he has been teaching Indigenous studies for 10 years at several universities, including McMaster, Ryerson, and Carleton. He says symbolic actions can only do so much.
Those Canadians that are paying attention to Indigenous issues and can think critically, I feel, are seeing through a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the discourse. For me, I do not see a lot of movement towards reconciliation. I see a lot of symbolic and superficial gestures, inclusion at events for Canada 150, but no substantive changes, no structural changes. And so I am very pessimistic.
In fact, King says that some Canadians may be well-intentioned, but it's important to remember not to appropriate Indigenous culture. This has been Joshua Susi for I'mNotJoshing.com.